have reached the end of our new broadcast. Up next is the Architect programs, where our expert guests will discuss Adriel Forti and Christopher Alexander's understanding form and function. Don't miss this highly competitive program. Good evening.
Dear viewers, today we have a very special guest, Mr. Efe Tekin for Arch Rivals. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, Mr. Tekin, can you explain us the relationship between form and design?
Well, I certainly can. The main goal of design is form. If the world were completely ordered and homogeneous, there would be no force or shape. Everything would be amorphous. But in a disordered world, things try to compensate for their irregularities. And this is how we take shape. We talk about irregularities as the functional origins of form. To achieve physical clarity in a designer must first have programmatic clarity in their mind and actions. For this to be possible, the designer must analyze the design problem deeply, follow it to its core functional roots, and find a pattern within it.
So, what I understand, a designer needs to comprehend the design problem very deeply and create the most functional form possible, right?
Yes, exactly. Every design problem begins with an effort to create harmony between two elements, form and context. Form is the solution to the problem, meanwhile context is what defines the problem. In other words, when we talk about design, we are not just talking about the form, but about the whole system that includes both form and context. Good harmony is about how this system is divided into form and context. There are many examples of such systems. The biological system, which consists of living organism and its environment, is the most well known. People usually call this good adaptation, but similar relationships exist in many other cases. For example, a suit and tie could create a system.
Or for a chess game, for every position, there is always an ideal move, right?
Yes, the same applies to music notes. If we consider a truck driver and a traffic sign, the design of the sign must match the driver's visual needs. In urban design, the system consists of a city and its habits, the human background that defines the need for new buildings, and the physical environment of existing spaces create the context for the city to grow and form. In extreme cases, we can even consider a culture as a system, where fashions and artistics work slowly adapt to the rest of the community.
When new buildings are made, necessary structure and physical environment define the context. Then the designer must create most suitable form. The rest of the design comes from fashion and culture.
The correctness of form depends on how well it fits to the rest of the system. In most real cases, a designer must consider several overlapping layers of the system at the same time. Let's take a teapot as an example. It exists within a system that includes its use, production, and the world outside the teapot. At first, it looks like the teapot and the system have a clear boundary because the teapot is a clearly defined object. However, we can easily change this boundary if we say that a kettle is a bad way to heat water at home. We might end up redesigning the entire house. In this case, the context pushes back and influences the form. Or you might decide that the problem is not the kettle itself, but the method of heating water. In this case, the kettle becomes a part of the context and the stove becomes the form.
If that's the case, what's the responsibility of the designer?
A good designer must observe all possible changes in the system. They must be sensitive to multiple overlapping boundaries at the same time. The ability to manage these boundaries in harmony is often called a designer's sense of organization. Form is the part of the world we control and shape. Context is the part of the world that makes demands on the form. Harmony is the relationship between mutual acceptance between form and context.
What's the next step after this?
The next step is characterizing the harmony between form and context. Let's make a simple example from engineering. If we want to make a metal surface perfectly smooth and flat, we can place it against a standard steel block. The standard block defines the context, and the metal surface is the form. If the metal surface is not completely flat, ink marks will appear at higher points. By sanding these points down and repeating the process, we achieve a perfect fit. In this case, context is fixed and only the form changes.
So what you are saying is that we need mathematical calculations to judge how well fits the form it is in its context. Does it really apply to the real world?
In the real world, trial and error design is a great method, but it is too expensive and slow. That's why we try to replace real world trial and error with symbolic methods.
I see. That means trial and error mostly completed on paper because real world testing is too costly.
Exactly. We should not expect to fully define the context in complex situations. If we could, there will be no design problems. Context and form complement each other.
I see. Even if we don't know the correct form, we can identify the wrong form and eliminate it.
You're exactly right. Imagine you have a box of buttons and you are given one button to match. How do you proceed? You scan the buttons. Instead of looking for a perfect match, you eliminate the ones that do not match. When you find the button with no differences, you say it's the correct one. In real world design, it's easier to identify bad matches than to define a perfect harmony.
An example could be a man that's like coming from 18th century with long hair and building Gothic mansions. That could seem strange to us because they don't fit the modern time.
Even in daily life, we mostly recognize bad matches rather than the perfect harmony. The same happens in house design. It's almost impossible to describe a perfectly fitting house, but it's very easy to name things that disturb harmony, like a kitchen that is hard to clean, no parking space for my car, children playing in dangerous areas, and rain water leaking inside.
So even if we don't know the perfect form, we can still find the perfect form by eliminating the wrong ones.
Exactly.
Well, thank you for coming all the way here, and thank you for everyone to tuning us today. We will.
Hello everyone, this week on Architalks we will give you information about form in architecture. Form is one of the three main terms of architectural modernism, which the other two are space and design. Architecture is not alone in its independence on form, in all other arts and in culture in general. Form has become an essential category that helps explore areas that can be analyzed. The discussion of form started in ancient times. Its pioneers are Aristotle and Plato. According to Plato, forms, which are ideas, provide a framework to explain change in the physical world and how objects are perceived. The unchanging and perfect thing is the form. Objects perceived by the senses are reflections of these forms. In his works, like the Republican Credulus, Plato explains that when a carpenter makes a new shuttle, he takes the ideal form as a model, not the broken one. Plato suggests that objects in the material world are only similar to unchanging forms. Plato's student Aristotle avoided making such a strict distinction between form and the object. In general, Aristotle did not believe that forms have an absolute existence independent of the objects they are in. In his work, Metaphysics, he said, a thing and its essence are one and the same, arguing that form and concrete objects are inseparable. Aristotle used form to mean shape or idea, but his most comprehensive definition is, what I mean by form is the essence and primary substance of every being. Aristotle's thoughts on form did not only come from his critical approach to Plato, they also came from his studies on the development process of plants and animals. In his work on the parts of animals, he argued that we cannot understand the essence of something by looking at its development process. Instead, we should consider its completed state. During the Renaissance, the concept of form was derived from classical philosophy and circulated among Renaissance humanists in the 15th and 16th centuries. If the word form was used, it was usually just as a synonym for shape. The only exception was Renaissance humanists who tried to show that architecture matched the worldview of ancient philosophers and even offered an analogy to their processes. In a work of his that he was written in the mid-15th century, Alberti successfully used some ancient theories of form. He made the famous claim, within the form of and figure of a building, there's a natural perfection that excites the mind and is immediately recognized by it. On the other hand, he also stated it is absolutely possible to design all forms in the mind without referring to any material, which aligns with Neoplatonic thought. Erwin Panofsky interpreted Alberti's distinction between materia, which means products of nature, and lineamenti, which means products of thought, in the same terms. Since Panofsky tended to view everything through the lenses of form with a modernist approach, he translated lineamenti as form. However, this translation is not very convincing because Alberti's definition of lineamenti does not match any ancient or modern concept of form. Alberti described lineamenti as follows: the lines and angles that define the surround and the surfaces of a building are correctly and infallibly combined and arranged. However, the Aristotelian concept of form did not find much place in Renaissance architectural thought, but it did appear in discussion about sculpture. According to Erwin Panofsky, Michelangelo's idea that the sculpture surrounds the artist's thought is certainly based on Aristotelian principles. In architecture, however, the Aristotelian understanding of form is rarely encountered. One example is seen in Daniele Barbaro's commentary on Vitruvius. Barbaro wrote, "In every work created through reason and completed by drawing, there is proof of the form and quality in the artist's mind, because the artist first works in his mind and then shapes the external matter according to the internal state, especially in architecture." After the Renaissance, it can be said that the concepts of form developed in ancient philosophy were interesting to humanist scholars, but they did not have a major impact on architectural practice or terminology until the 19th century. Throughout the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, and even in the 19th century outside German-speaking countries, when architects and critics talked about form, they almost always meant just shape. For example, when Palladio said buildings are admired more for their forms than their materials, it is clear that he did not mean it in a metaphysical sense, despite his connection to Daniele Barbaro. Evolution of the concept of form in architecture. In 1836, August Pugin used the word form in his book Contrasts while discussing the superiority of Gothic architecture over Roman architecture. However, he meant only shape and appearance, not a metaphysical meaning. In the 19th century, the word form began to gain more philosophical meaning. Influenced by philosophers like Kant and Hegel, discussions on art and architecture started to treat form not just as a physical shape, but as an aesthetic and intellectual concept. These ideas laid to groundwork for modernist architecture in the late 19th and the early 20th century. Form was no longer seen merely as the physical appearance of an object, but as a concept related to its function, structural logic, and aesthetic expression. Form in modernist architecture in the 20th century, the concept of form underwent a radical change in architecture. Especially modernist architects played a big role in relating form to function. Le Corbusier argued in his book Vers on Architecture that form is not just an aesthetic matter, but a result of rational and functional order. According to his famous statement, architecture is the wise and correct arrangement of volumes under light. Similarly, the Bauhaus school and Walter Gropius argued that decoration in architecture is unnecessary and that form should arise solely from function. The principle form follows function became the motto of this period. This approach reached its peak when, with Ludwig Mies, won der Rohe's philosophy of less is more. According to Mies, the form of a building should come from its structural logic and the nature of the materials used. In the mid-20th century, architects like Louis Kahn offered a critical perspective on the strict functionalism of modernism. Kahn argued that form is related not only to function, but also to spiritual and metaphysical dimensions. By saying form is the expression of the reason for something's existence, he emphasized the importance of meaning and identity in architecture. Philosophical foundations of the concept of form. The meaning of form is not only an architectural, but also a philosophical topic. Since ancient Greece, the concept of form has been interpreted in different ways by various philosophers. Plato and Aristotle's understanding of form are important sources influencing how form is perceived in architecture. According to Plato, reality is a reflection of ideal forms that exist in a realm separate from the sensory world. In architecture, this represents the relationship between the ideal form and the physical form. Aristotle, on the other hand, defined form as combining with matter to create the essence of an object, laying the foundations for the balance between function and aesthetics in architecture. From the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, these philosophical understandings encouraged an architectural order based on mathematical and geometric principles. The Romantics argued that the principles of an organic form in nature were connected to art and culture. Goethe suggested that form is variable and develops internally. Schlegel emphasized that organic form is derived from nature and, unlike mechanical form, is shaped by its own nature. The Romantic idea of living form maintained Kant's view of form but introduced the notion that form could reflect an eternal life force, creating a new distinction in idealistic philosophy. Continuing with philosophical idealism for idealist philosophers, especially Hegel, appearances presented to the senses conceal an idea within or beyond them. This approach is based on Plato, but also critiques him. The purpose of aesthetics was to reveal this fundamental idea. At the beginning of the 19th century in Germany, the concept of form was defined in different ways. In Kant, it was a feature of perception. In Goethe, it was a genetic principle, and in Hegel, it was an element knowable only by the mind. These different meanings were intertwined in architecture. In the late 19th century, the concept of form became even more complex. Formalism became dominant throughout the century. Herbert argued that works of art consist of unique form relationships independent of meaning and defined aesthetics through psychological perception. Herbert's ideas were transformed into the science of form by Robert Zimmermann and related to architecture. Zimmermann's science of form deepened the understanding of aesthetics by focusing on the relationship between forms and offered a perceptual perspective. Herbert and his followers saw form as an external mode of perception, emphasizing formalist aesthetics. Architects also adopted this approach, exploring the functional, aesthetic, and psychological effects of form, which laid the foundation for modern architecture. Zimmermann's science of form emphasized the relationship between shapes, offering a perceptual viewpoint and detaching form from inner meanings. Architects adopted this approach, focusing on the psychological and visual effects of form. This understanding laid the aesthetics foundation of modern architecture, linking form with functionality and emotional impact. Adolf Göller laid the foundation for abstract art and marked a turning point in the understanding of aesthetics. Hermann Lotze and Robert Vischer's ideas introduced the concept of empathy into architecture, bringing a new perspective to aesthetics. Henry Hoeflin argued that form in architecture expresses moods or emotions and gains meaning only by connecting with the body. According to Hoeflin, form and matter are inseparable. Form emerges from matter and resists it. This view contributed to the emergence of new forms in modern architecture. Adolf Hildebrand defined form as something perceivable only by the mind and argued that the inner meaning of form in architecture should be perceived effectively beyond what is visibly seen. These views sparked a deep reflection of the meaning and aesthetics of form in architecture and laid the foundations for modern architectural thought. In modernism, form is generally understood as the rejection of decoration and a focus on functionality. This understanding dates back to the secession movement in Vienna in the 1890s, particularly to Adolf Loos. In his essay Ornament and Crime, Loos argued that decoration threatens form. In his 1898 essay The Principle of Clothing, he stated, "Every material has its own language of form," emphasizing the harmony between material and form. Loos simplified Semper's relationship between form and material, arguing that form arises purely from the material and the decoration distorts this pure form. This view forms the basis of modernist understanding of form. In 20th century modernist architecture, the concept of form became prominent for several reasons. It was not a metaphor. It implied that the true essence of architecture was beyond sensory perceptions. It linked aesthetic perception with the material world, and it provided architects with a field of study under their control. However, these factors did not clarify the meaning of form. It is necessary to look at the different meanings in which form is used. In modernism, form is widely used as a resistance to decoration, defining the non-decorative aspect of architecture. In 20th century modernist architecture, the concept of form was used both as resistant to decoration and as an antidote to mass culture. According to Muthesius, form is a fundamental element of culture, and formlessness is defined as philistine, reflecting a high cultural necessity at the aesthetics level. Muthesius's views were part of a resistance to the effects of capitalism. These ideas influenced modernists in Germany in the 1920s. The understanding of form was developed under the influence of Hegel and Semper. Mythicius' view of form also caused some issues in education. Especially in Walter Gropius's Curriculum at the Bauhaus, there was a debate on whether form should be taught as a metaphysical category. This approach marked a turning point in architectural thought in the 1920s. 20th century modernism's concept of form and its relationship with social values. 20th century modernism used the concept of form as a resistance to ornamentation and decoration. In 1911, at the Deutsche Werkbund Congress, Hermann Mythicius compared form to barbarism and impressionism, equating formlessness with the bourgeoisie. According to Mythicius, form is a fundamental necessity of culture, while formlessness is something modernism rejects. He argued that form is a guarantee against the soullessness of modern economic life and defined Art Nouveau in Impressionism as harmful. Mythicius' views represented resistance to the effects of capitalism. In this understanding, form was seen not only as a means to achieve modernity, but also as resistance to the negative aspects of modernism. This idea played an important role in modernist architecture in the 1920s. At the Bauhaus, Walter Gropius emphasized the importance of the creative process in the embodiment of form while trying to teach students the metaphysical principles of form. Gropius argued that form is not just a result of architecture, but also that modern production methods would create unconventional forms. In the 1960s, Kevin Lynch emphasized the importance of understanding the physical shapes of cities and questioned the relationship between form and social values. He argued that the hidden forms in cities should be made visible. According to Lynch, there is a connection between form and social values, and this connection should be considered in urban planning. Functionalist architects like Mies van der Rohe believed that form was merely the result of structural problems and regarded the pursuit of style as formalism. From this perspective, modern architecture should focus on functionality and technology. Form and social concerns, as Diane Girardo noted, the main continuity between modernist and postmodernist architects lies in the renewed emphasis on the power of form. This emphasis, along with the priority given to design, has led to the exclusion of alternative strategies for improving cities and living conditions. In contrast, in the 1920s, Adolf Bethne argued in his book Modern Functional Building that form is a social issue and aimed to invalidate the functionalist approach. Bethne emphasized that form is not only for solving building problems, but also for considering all buildings as a collective whole. This collective understanding should appeal to society as a whole and be shaped by valid principles. Bethne's views were based on sociologist George Simmel's understanding of socialization. According to Simmel, as great works of art are created, the individuality of the creator becomes less evident, and the works gain cultural significance. Bethne emphasized that form expresses not only individuality, but also its connections with society. Form should be seen as a social phenomenon and accepted as a tool reflecting the values of a society. Form and social forms, Bethne's ideas became an important part of the new architecture movement in the 1920s. Bruno Taut also suggested that architecture would create new social forms. In 1955, the Smithsons argued that architectural forms have the power to shape society and that each form, by embodying life itself, creates social forms. This view represents a controversial and powerful aspect of modernism's understanding of form. Form is seen not only as architecture, but also as a force that shapes social structures and societies. Form and functionalism, Simmel's understanding of form, also influenced other disciplines, such as linguistics. The study of language was based on Goethe's theory of form, contributing to modern thought. Functionalist architects argued that form is based on functionality and prioritized structural needs over aesthetic concerns. This approach emphasized that form is not only an aesthetic value, but also serves a functional and social purpose. Form and meaning architects like Herzberger and Eisenman used form to exclude issues of meaning. In this approach, form is seen more as a structural or functional tool, independent of the architect's concern for creating meaning during the design process. In contrast, the excessive emphasis on form was criticized for ignoring issues like meaning and symbolism. Criticism was most famously expressed by American architect Robert Venturi. In the second edition of his book Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, Venturi argued that in the early 1960s, architecture focused on only form, neglecting processes of meaning and interpretation. This was a criticism of modernism's obsession with simple and abstract forms in architecture. Book Learning from Las Vegas, co-written with Denise Scott Brown, took these ideas even further. The book argued against modernism and suggested that architecture should not be shaped only by abstract form, but also by symbolism and images from everyday life. Venturi and Scott Brown criticized modernists' and heroic and original understanding of architecture, emphasizing the importance of past experiences and symbolism in creating architectural forms. In their approach, which they described as ugly and ordinary, conventional structures and ordinary elements from everyday life were used symbolically and expressively to create richness. Form and reality modern art, especially abstractions, is directly related to the theories of form developed in Germany at the end of 19th century. Hildebrand's 1893 essay and the works of German historians like Riegel, Wöhringer, and Wölfflin determined the importance of form in art and architecture and contributed to its general acceptance. Similarly, British critics Cleve Bell and Roger Fry contributed to the role of form in creating the meaning of art. These theories led to the acceptance of form as an abstract language and shaped interpretive processes in architecture. Form, while modernist art advocated for pure form, Dadaists and Surrealists pursued chaos and formlessness. Georges Bataille celebrated formlessness as a lack of meaning. In the 1950s, the anti-form movement opposed the effects of capitalism. Situationist architects proposed temporary and shapeless structures. Constance's New Babylon city avoided static elements. Formless architecture is not the absence of form, but rather a different approach to it. The contrast between form and technical or environmental factors in the 19th century, Viollet-le-Duc emphasized the contrast between form and structure, arguing that all architecture should be born from a structural foundation. According to Viollet, the Renaissance mistake was prioritizing form and lacking a structural system. This contrast played an important role in modernist architecture and continued in the writings of historian Rainer Bonham in the 1950s and 1960s. Bonham combined his resistance to form with situationist ideas, informality from visual artists, and technological rationalism. In his essay, The New Brutalism, he focused on designs that aimed to create a consistent visual image in non-formal ways. Bonham believed that the future of architecture would be shaped by the impact of technology. This approach is evident in his book, The Architecture of Well-Tempered Environment. Cedric Price's Fun Palace project from 1964 reflected a similar approach. The building was designed in a flexible and constantly changing form, allowing users to choose their own paths and participation levels. Influenced by situationist thought, this project aimed to create spaces that would enable individuals to freely reshape their daily lives. This trend was also seen in projects like Archigram's works and the Centre Pompidou. The combination of technology and the idea of freedom led to new architectural approaches. However, the Centre Pompidou was criticized by some for resembling Mies van der Rohe's American projects. The future of form. So, what is the future of form? It is clear that it is not a permanent or timeless category in architectural discourse. Developed in the 19th century as a solution to specific problems, especially the nature of aesthetic perception and natural morphology processes. The concept of form was highly productive in these areas and many related topics. However, its success in addressing the different problems of 20th century architecture is debatable.